Kia ora everybody and welcome back to Theology, where we drink tea and talk theology. Today we are still drinking Lychee Tea and continuing our discussion on the covenant. Now, it's a good thing that I like Lychee Tea because I've been drinking it for a while now and we've still got like two more to go in terms of the covenant series. Though I am getting close to running out, which is a little bit sad. So, today, however, we are getting to the last Old Testament covenant, or the last one that is like formally made and established in the Old Testament. It gets a bit interesting when you start looking at it otherwise. And this covenant is detailed in 2 Samuel 7 and in 1 Chronicles 17. And this is the covenant that David and God make together, that God makes with David. Now, there isn't much on this being a suzerainty covenant. I could figure out how to make it work, but there is so much other interesting stuff with this covenant that I'm not going to. Though it does have to be a suzerainty covenant on some level because there is just that huge inequality between parties, and the way that they made it, you could debate, could go either way. However, this is often more commonly referred to as a promissory covenant, which is a covenant that is based on fulfillment of a promise. And so the covenant is made about a promise. So more like an engagement, where that's an agreement to get married in the future and you're promising that to each other, as opposed to a marriage where there is more of an official covenant and things have been done. And people also like to discuss that the other promissory covenant in the Old Testament is Abraham. And so there are a lot of parallels between Abraham and David. There are also a lot of other parallels, like the others in the Bible. Anyway, now this is because the covenant is fulfilled with a promise, just like it was fulfilled with a promise with Abraham. And that promise is the promise of a few, but the main one is the promise of the Davidic dynasty, or like David's royal line. Now, one of the interesting things with this covenant is that the word covenant isn't used at all in the passage in 1 Chronicles or in 2 Samuel. And the word for covenant, berith, is not used at all, and not even like we talked about in an earlier episode, is the word karath, meaning to cut, used. Neither. No words that could imply the making of a covenant in that way are used. However, we get the idea from God promising to keep his promises forever, which is a part of a covenant. And it talks about them being promises, but it still kind of follows the structure of a covenant, with there being an offer and dogs are barking. Bella, stop! However, the word covenant is used in reference to this covenant. The word covenant is used not just in reference by someone way later, like we see with Hosea talking about Adam, but by one of the people in the covenant themselves. And it's talked about in the Psalms. It is talked about particularly in Psalm 89 verse 3. I made a covenant with my chosen one. I swore an oath to David, my servant. This isn't the only instance where it talks about it being a covenant, but it is the most obvious one where it says it being a covenant. But most of this covenant comes from it being in the Psalms and is revealed in the Psalms explicitly as a covenant. So we'll get into the details of the covenant now that we've established that it is a covenant, definitely. Or as much for our purposes here, we're going to treat it like a covenant. David is the king of Israel, and while his ride to get there was very tumultuous and rocky and stormy, really mostly the focus of 1 Samuel, or a lot of the focus of 1 Samuel. At the time the covenant is made, he is king. He already has evidence of God fulfilling and keeping his promises that he makes. And as God anointed him and promised him the throne, which he is now on. So God makes a covenant with David after he has been made king. But if God is just promising something to David, what makes that a covenant is what's going on, that exchange required to be a covenant. The exchange going on here started with David bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and his desire to build a temple for God. God, through Nathan, says, no, you will not build my temple. But from your seed, your line, my house will be built, which is kind of technically fulfilled twice. So that is what will be fulfilled through this covenant for God, is that he will have a dwelling place, and that he will have a permanent dwelling place built in Jerusalem in the form of a temple instead of having a tent set up from the tabernacle. Welcome back. My camera battery died, so we just are gonna pick up from where we left off. We've got little doggy friend here now. But yeah, so we're not my dog sitting currently. So we're gonna pick up from where we left off, and hopefully nothing's changed too much. So God makes some promises to David, and some of these promises are fulfilled in David's lifetime, and some can only be fulfilled, and we see fulfilled after his lifetime. So first off, he promises to make David a great name, and this can only really be done truly through God. We see this is an attempt made by the people building the Tower of Babel to make their name great in their own way, but only God can truly make a name great, and we see that his name is made great throughout the nations, and this further reflects on the greatness of God. So God makes promises to David, some of which are fulfilled during his life and some of which are fulfilled after his death. He also promises to provide a place for the people, which is done by inhabiting the land that was promised to them through Abraham, so inhabiting the promised land. And God is showing his faithfulness to Israel by providing them with the land and protection for them to keep remaining in the land, especially during David's reign. He is then promised rest from his enemies, which I think connects quite strongly to the next one, because it is providing the land and providing the rest from the enemies that would make it difficult for them to be in the land under David. The term rest here is specifically used in relation to land in the Bible, the specific Hebrew word that's used for rest. So it kind of means the land will have rest under David from the enemies all fighting in it. And that would cause the enemies to also then be expelled from the land. So there isn't that turmoil and fighting. There are then a few promises that are only able to truly be fulfilled after his death. One of these being the establishment of a house for God, the temple, and the other being the establishment of a house of David in David's line. So David's line we can only really see it truly continued after he is dead, because he will continue making his line until he dies. So we'll only know if it lasts once he is dead. And we see that it does through Solomon and so on. The other is the house of the Lord, which is the temple. And this cannot be built by David because he has blood on his hands with Uriah and Bathsheba. So it was built by his son Solomon, because it could only be done by a king, but it couldn't be done by David as a king, so the king's the only one that would have the power to actually get the resources. So it is fulfilled by Solomon. He then promises that one of his descendants will sit upon the throne forever. And this is ultimately fulfilled through Jesus. This is God promising the kingdom. He promises David that his kingdom will reign forever. And what he is promising is that God's kingdom will reign forever, and that God's kingdom and David's kingdom are going to be linked, which it is through Jesus and through his adoption into Joseph's family. Now, the temple being erected and the throne being filled by his descendants might initially be seen as being fulfilled through Solomon, because Solomon does erect the temple and he does fill the throne. But due to the use of the word eternal in relation to these texts, we know that this is ultimately truly fulfilled eternally by Jesus. We know that Jesus erects himself as the new temple, as the new place for the dwelling of the Holy of Holies. He is the Spirit and the Spirit is him, and now the temple is released with the splitting of the curtain of the Holy of Holies. And one of the other important things to note is that Israel now has a king. So what does this mean for God being king of Israel? How is he the leader and in charge of Israel if he is not the king? And that doesn't mean that God has replaced himself. Instead, it means that someone else is the head of Israel. Instead, the king is meant to act as his representative on earth. Like, there's conflict here, and there's lots of interesting discussions about whether or not this is what God wanted, because God and Samuel are both quite angry about this being asked for at the beginning of 1 Samuel, when Israel is asking for a king. But in Deuteronomy, there is a whole section of law for the kings. And so God anticipated the kings, even though he went, I am meant to be Israel's king. He knew they would ask for one. So he made laws so that the king would also show that Israel was set apart, and that Israel's king was not like other kings. He had to handwrite and make his own scrolls of the Torah. We also see the idea and the hope of a new Adam being formed again. By this point, we've kind of been duped a few times now, so we're getting weary. But there is that hope there. Maybe David is the person who is truly going to save us all and might be the best ruler. The idea particularly comes through the idea of David being the good king. Adam was made to rule, to be a steward of the earth and set apart. And David comes in, and here he is ruling over a nation that is set apart. And maybe he will be different. But again, he falls short with Bathsheba and his dealings with Uriah. Ultimately, though, this is a part of his fall, where we see that he is, just as all of the others have been, a broken human, a broken person, and that the sin is still there. But now, with the desire for Israel to have their new king, for their king to come back, and the constant setup of a new Adam, we have two themes that we're now looking for. We're looking for the new and true king, and we're looking out for the new Adam. And that is what we are keeping our eyes and ears open for as we get to the next covenant in the story. Ultimately, the Israelites, and after David and Solomon, spend a lot of time yearning for that not only new Adam, but the new David, the new king, the righteous and just king. They're living in the hope for the new king, just as the covenant with David sets us up to do, to be living in that hope for the king that will be good, that will be better than David even. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next week. Bye.